All right, we're going to look at John Donne's work, Devotions Upon Emergent Occasions, and several steps in my sickness. It's a prose work, unlike what we've looked at thus far, written by John Donne at the time when he was most certainly a cleric, published in 1624. And it covers a topic of great interest to those of us who are living in the times of COVID. As I said to you when we met in person, the topic of death and sickness leading unto death is one which we have found over the last few hundred years is not that often revisited by poets, writers, although we certainly see it in Leo Tolstoy's work, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And I mentioned in that comment to you that for Tolstoy and his protagonist, Ivan Ilyich, death is something that he has sought to avoid his entire life. And it is something to which he's largely been successful in avoiding because he has led a prosperous and wealthy life, has managed to climb the career ladder to the point at which he sees himself to some degree not immune to those things, but not required to meditate upon them or reflect upon death until he has a terrible accident and it leads him to a time of sickness and isolation and eventually death. And Tolstoy's metaphor for his approach to death is that of approaching a black sack, a sense of the absence of being, a sense of nothingness. And that sense of death as a vacuity or absence of light is a very good metaphor for the traditional Christian understanding of death as a privation of the good. And so it really is going into something that is evil. Now, what's paradoxical about Tolstoy's rendering of that is that it is something that he resists and fears, but ultimately is surprised to find leads to something on the other side, which is joyous. But that's a very different context than Dr. Donne is writing about when he is writing his devotions here and his meditations on the approach to death, which is through sickness. Most scholars think that Donne wrote this after in maybe December 1623, as he was recovering from a bout of serious illness, maybe a typhus fever of some sort. And he describes this in these devotions. That's possible that there is a biographical motive for this. But what we certainly see is a reflection on the manifold significance of sickness and death in this work. And I thought it was, as I say, worthy of our attention, if for no other reason that it seems rather topical. It's dedicated to Charles at this point, the king. And he says at the outset of this work, let's see if I can put this up on the screen here. I have had 3 births, one natural when I came into the world, one supernatural when I entered into the ministry, and now a preternatural birth in returning to life from this sickness. In my second birth, your Highness's royal father vouchsafed me his hand, not only to sustain me in it, but to lead me to it. In this last birth, I myself am born a father. This child of mine, this book, comes into the world from me and with me. And therefore, I presume, as I did the Father to the Father, to present the Son to the Son, this image of my humiliation to the lively image of His Majesty, Your Highness. It might be enough that God hath seen my devotions, but examples of good kings are commandments. And Hezekiah writ the meditations of his sickness after his sickness. Besides, as I've lived to see, not as a witness only, but as a partaker, the happiness of a part of your royal family's father's time, so shall I live in my way to see the happiness of the times of your Highness 2. If this child of mine, inanimated by your gracious acceptation, may so long preserve alive the memory of your highness, humblest and devotedest John Donne. So there's the dedication to Prince Charles at the time. He writes this, and then he goes to proceed to lay out the contents of his book. And you'll note that they are marked by the stations of the sickness. Now, these are not the stations of the cross, but they are related to his life. And we're not going to look at all of the stations here. We're going to look at the 4th and the 5th and the 17th and the 21st of them. But I thought I would briefly scan over the contents to give you a sense of the progression in the work. So it begins with the first alteration. Now, remember, alteration and change are associated with mutability, with fallenness, and sickness is the product of sin. That's Donne's understanding. That's his age's understanding. It's a reflection on that fact. And he's going to make those train of associations here throughout. So the first alteration is the first grudging of the sickness. Then he moves in the second, to the strength and the function of the senses and the other faculties, which change and fail. The patient takes his bed. In the third, the physician is sent for. That will be the 4th episode that we will discuss in further detail. Then the physician comes. We will look at that as well. The physician is afraid at what he finds. The physician desires to have others join with him. The king sends his own physician, etc. So you can see what we have here is a dramatic presentation of what is in fact a meditation upon our human condition. Note that these are exactly, and they are upon emergent occasions and several steps in my sickness, digested into 3 parts: meditations, expostulations, and in the expostulations and debates with God. That's where we're going to begin. And finally, with prayers interspersed within that. So there are meditations, there are expostulations, which are forms of arguing with God, just as Job did. And then there are prayers within that as well. So let me say a little bit about this word meditations by way of prelude to my discussion. Meditations have a rich heritage in the West and in the East of Christendom. Marcus Aurelius writes meditations as well. There as a Stoic contemplating the law and the significance of life and so forth. But by Christians, it gets adapted to be a meditation upon God and his perfections. In Donne's day, it becomes famous in the work of a Jesuit writer, Ignatius of Loyola, whose spiritual exercises becomes very influential on Catholic spirituality. And so these are a form of meditation that Donne would know and be conversant in, although he is no longer practicing that form of meditation, at least I don't think, as an Anglican cleric, and is no longer necessarily reflecting upon Ignatius of Loyola either. He is reflecting on God and his ways, having said that. And when he writes this, it's clearly a theological exercise. Now that's clear in Donne's work. It's also clear and let me just make a little side note here. It's also clear in an author I mentioned a little bit earlier when I was talking about the first anniversary, René Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy. He is also writing a sort of a theological treatise, and it's really interesting to see where he begins with that. Let me see if I can find that and put it on the screen for you. Here it is. This is René Descartes, Meditations on First Philosophy, of which there are 6. And he begins with the premise of doubt. As I said in our previous episode. Descartes' cogito, the cogito ergo sum, the famous cogito, is actually not basing philosophy on the premise of thinking. He's basing it on the premise of doubt. That's how he begins his meditation, which has theological import. That's why it's called a meditation. And note how he begins this. Some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed and by how doubtful was the structure of the beliefs that I had based on them. I realized that if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, I needed just once in my life to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. So that is how Descartes begins his meditations. It is by destroying the world of appearances, everything that and the inherited knowledge that he had received. That's how he's going to be in his meditations. Now, this is a very odd tack to take in terms of meditations. The usual tack, one that we will find that Dr. Donne uses here, is a little bit more usual. Let me look at the beginning of Donne's meditations here. Let me share the screen for you here. And I'm not going to spend my time looking at the first, but just to show how it begins. Variable and therefore miserable condition of man. This minute I was well and am ill. This minute I am surprised with a sudden change and alteration to worse, and can impute it to no cause, nor call it by any name. We study health, and we deliberate upon our meats and drink and air and exercises, and we hew and we polish every stone that goes to that building. And so our health is a long and regular work. But in a minute, a cannon batters all, overthrows all, demolishes all, a sickness unprevented for all our diligence, unsuspected for all our curiosity, nay, undeserved, if we consider only disorder, summons us, seizes us, possesses us, destroys us in an instant. Oh, miserable condition of man. This is the wonderful beginning of Donne's meditation. He's reflecting on the human condition, as he says at the outset. It's the frailty of the human condition, the surprise, the ways in which, for all of our attempts to bolster our frame, our human frame, we are nonetheless subject to sickness. Unsuspected, unpreventable, and it alters us for the worse. So that's how he begins his meditation. He moves from that to his first expostulation. Now, the expostulation, as I said, is a form of argument. In the field of rhetoric, it is a argumentative process and a type of address containing that. And it's trying to reason. He's reasoning with God. But there is an element of protest to it. And what we're going to find is he's going to move back and forth in his meditation or his devotions between a meditation and an expostulation and then a prayer, before moving to a second meditation and a second expostulation and then a prayer, and so on. Meditation, expostulation, prayer. So note how he begins with meditation, however, a reflection on the way things are, before he moves to the way to the problem he finds with this, before moving in the third part to a prayer on that. So he begins with the first alteration before moving, as I said, to the nature of the human frame, the strength of the senses in general, and then falling into sickness. He goes to his bed, physician sent for, the physician comes, the physician is not pleased by what he finds. In fact, he is afraid and wants the company of others to come to his side. So it's interesting, the physician it does not want to be alone in this judgment. And so much so that the king's physician is sent for, and then they prescribe upon him what they should do. But he begins, let me see if I can find here and put it on the screen for you. he is sent for. And what we have in our book, let me see here, is not the whole of the fourth devotion. It is the expostulation. So we cut out, so the physician is sent for, and we are given in our text the expostulation, but note that it is in the middle of the meditation and the prayer, and that is cut out. We don't have the meditation or the prayer, we simply have the expostulation. So it begins with a sort of argumentative tone. Now, that's the editorial decision that has been taken by the editors. And in some ways, it's a dramatic way to introduce it. It's not the one that Donne uses. However, what he used, and let me just read the first lines of that. It is too little to call man a little world. It might be too little, but it's something that Donne does regularly as microcosm analogy. Except God, man is a diminutive to nothing. Man consists of more pieces, more parts than the world doth, nay, than the world is. And if those pieces were extended and stretched out in man as they are in a world, man would be the giant and the world the dwarf, the world but the map, and the man the world. And then he goes on to apply this analogy still further to the veins and the bodies and so on and so forth, and various other forms of analogies. But these rejections of the idea of a microcosm are the very ones that he introduces in other poems. So he is noting the likeness and also the unlikeness of his own analogies. But as I say, let me stick to the text that we have in our broad view anthology of 17th century verse and prose, and begin with the expostulation. And he notes this: I have not the righteousness of Job, but I have the desire of Job. I would speak to the Almighty, and I would reason with God. Just like Job, he's been afflicted. My God, how soon wouldst thou have me go to the physician? And how far wouldst thou have me go with the physician? And now he meditates on the problems of medicine. This is really interesting, and talks about the ways in which the physician can actually be an impediment to God's will. But let me go to back to the text. And the man and the art, and I go not from thee when I go to the physician. Thou didst not make clothes before there was a shame of the nakedness of the body, but thou didst make physic before there was any grudging of any sickness. For thou didst imprint a medicinal virtue in many simples, even from the beginning. Didst thou mean that we should be sick when thou didst so? When thou madest them? No more than thou didst mean that we should sin when thou madest us. Thou foresawest both, but causest neither. So he's reflecting on the fact that the healing properties of plants were there in the beginning, from the beginning. But that did not mean, and this is almost like a Miltonic discussion of the consequences of the fall, if God foreknew the consequences of the fall before the fall, and thereby effectively determined that it would be so. Donne rejects this, but note how this is an expostulation. It's argumentative, it's reasoning through the process. Back to the text. Thou, Lord, promised here trees whose fruit shall be for meat and their leaves for medicine. It is the voice of thy son. Wilt thou be made whole? Ask the question. Remember, to the man lying at the pool of Siloam, that draws from the patient a confession that he was ill and could not make himself well. And it is thine own voice. Is there no physician that inclines us, disposes us to accept thine ordinance? And it is the voice of the wise man, both for the matter, physic itself. The Lord hath created medicines out of the earth, and he that is wise shall not abhor them. And for the art and the person, the physician cutteth off a long disease. In all these voices, thou sendest us to those helps which thou hast afforded in that. Then he changes tack a little bit. But wilt thou not Wilt not thou avow that voice too? He that hath sinned against his maker, let him fall into the hands of the physician. And wilt thou not afford me an understanding of those words? Thou who sendest us for a blessing to the physician, dost not make it accursed to us to go when thou sendest. Is not the curse rather in this, that only he falls into the hands of the physician that casts himself wholly, entirely on the physician, confides in him, relies upon him, attends all from him, and neglects that spiritual physic which thou also hast instituted in thy church. So medicine can become an idol, is what he's saying. This is the problem with the physician. We can be wholly dependent on it. We can see it as determinative. It can replace God. It can replace our accountability. It can replace the very source of healing and the means of healing in the object of healing rather than in the one who is the healer. This is the expostulation. Remember, it's argumentative. He's reasoning through this. So to fall into the hands of the physician is a sin in that case, and a punishment of former sins. So as Asa fell, who in his disease sought not to the Lord, but to the physician. Reveal therefore to me thy method, O Lord, and see whether I have followed it, that thou mayest have glory, if I have, and I pardon if I have not, and help that I may. Thy method is, and now he quotes, and here it's in the italics, in time of thy sickness, be not negligent. Wherein wilt thou have my diligence expressed? Pray unto the Lord, and he will make thee whole. O Lord, I do. Pray, and pray thy servant David's prayer. Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am weak. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are vexed. I know that even my weakness is a reason, a motive to induce thy mercy, and my sickness an occasion of thy sending health. When art thou so ready? When is it so seasonable to thee to commiserate, as in misery? But is prayer for health in season as soon as I am sick? Thy method goes further. Leave off from sin, and order thy hands aright, and cleanse thy heart from all wickedness. So now he's drawing the connection explicitly in certain instances between sin and sickness. And even in the seeking of health, the sin may persist. He's drawing those connections as well, because we're not going to the Lord for healing. We're trusting in our own hands, our own devices. And then note that it's a dialogue. It's a back and forth expostulation. Have I, O Lord, done so? O Lord, I have. By thy grace, I am come to a holy detestation of my former sin. Is there any more? In thy method, there is more. Give a sweet savor and a memorial of fine flour, and make a fat offering as not being. And Lord, by thy grace, I have done that. Sacrificed a little of that little which thou lentest me to them for whom thou lentest it. And now, in thy method and by thy steps, I am come to that. Then give place to the physician, for the Lord hath created him. Let him not go from thee, for thou hast need of him. I send for the physician, but I will hear him enter with those words of Peter, Jesus Christ, make thee whole. I long for his presence, but I look that the power of the Lord should be present to heal me. So note that he is not only sick and sending for the physician, he's thinking about the ways in which he may improperly send for a physician. He might be doing so to his own detriment. Much to reflect on here, characteristic of the age, seeing levels of health and healing and life for that matter, as we saw at the very outset of the work, in which he describes three forms of life, his natural life, his spiritual life, and now the life that he's going to live through means of his book, an afterlife, as it were. And he will continue on with that. I'm going to cut it off there. I'm not going to go to the prayer, but note that he then does offer a prayer. And that pattern there of meditation, expostulation, and prayer is one that he holds to throughout. I'm sorry that the editors did not capture that here, but I've managed to do so here in my brief little lecture. I'll pick it up next time with, from the fifth meditation, the meditation itself.